Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zoya in Beijing. Eradicating hunger and poverty in an increasingly wealthy world is arguably humanity's most meaningful task. The international community has never stopped in this endeavor. But how and when might we end hunger in our lifetime on this planet? What are the threats to global food security? What progress has China made in lifting a vast number of people out of poverty and hunger? And can the experience be emulated by other developing countries, particularly the least developed ones? Today, we are joined by Earth Friend Cousin, who is Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. She has more than 25 years of national and international nonprofit, government, and corporate leadership experience focusing on hunger, food, and resilience strategies. But before we get started, let's take a look at this. And welcome to Dialogue, and welcome to our program, Ms. Cousin. How do you feel about the fact that this world is still facing hunger? 1 out of 9 people are still suffering hunger or malnutrition. How do you feel about this? And what troubles you the most?
Well, it gets me up out of the bed every single morning. What troubles me the most is that we as a global community maintain the tools to end hunger in our lifetime. Yet what we lack is the public will to actually make it happen, to make those investments that are necessary to ensure that we address the challenges of vulnerable people before when the rains don't come, before it becomes a disaster, when drought happens, before it becomes a disaster, and giving people the tools that are required for them to build the resilience that's necessary to feed their own children. We can do this if we as a global community truly commit to doing the work.
What is the most threatening or troubling scene that you have encountered in your lifetime and career?
Well, the most devastating scene is one that I've witnessed personally. And that was about 1.5 years ago when I was traveling in South Sudan and Ethiopia. The border between South Sudan and Ethiopia, where the refugees were crossing, women with their children who had walked for days without food, without water, and the children were severely malnourished and dehydrated. I was standing talking to a physician from MSF when I heard a woman start to just scream, a blood-chilling scream that made us stop. And I said, "What was that?" He said, "We lost one." When she came in, she was carrying a 3-month-old baby that had been with food, and because she had no water, no food, she couldn't breastfeed the child. And the child died right there as we were standing there. And that was a life that we could have saved if it had not been for war, if she had had access to food. This was a child who never really had a chance because the world was not providing the assistance that was necessary fast enough.
Actually, the food scarcity problem is probably seen everywhere and in every period of human history. Here in China, the Chinese always think very high of food security. There is a Chinese saying, it says, people regard food as the prime want. And actually, throughout the history of the Chinese nation, we've seen hunger and warfare because of hunger. It's only in 1950s and 60s there was a huge famine that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Only about 3 decades ago, China began to feed itself. What do you make of China's efforts of rid itself of hunger? And is this experience copyable to other places and people?
The world said China would never feed itself. And not only does China feed itself, but it's become a net exporting country now. And while there are still challenges here, the majority of people were pulled out of hunger and out of poverty by a government that focused on meeting the needs of those who live in rural areas, addressing the challenges of creating a productive agriculture system, and moved 700 million people into food security. That lesson is one the world must take note of.
What they can learn from China's example and what they can. Is there any good examples?
Yes, there are. And the Minister of Agriculture and I were just having this conversation today. It's about agricultural productivity. It's about investing in the type of agriculture that increases the quality and quantity of yield, supporting agricultural infrastructure development, post-harvest handling methods that reduce loss. Those are things that are replicable. It's also about investing in education. There's a requirement that those who live in rural areas have equal access to, or equitable access to education as those who live in urban areas. And it's also about ensuring that farmers have access to information about
and market
and access to information about the downstream work that is necessary to support their agricultural production, but also providing sustainable, durable market opportunities.
But even now, many people here in China are still worrying whether China can feed itself in the 21st century. We have 1.3, probably 1.4 billion by the end of 2030 something. Do you think China can feed its people? Because the challenge is there is climate change, there is growing population, shrinking arable land size.
Yes, China can feed its people. China, as I said, has moved 700 million people out of food insecurity. There are about 70 million people in China today that remain food insecure. And China is working to address the challenge of that population having access to the same tools that we were just talking about to ensure their ability to move forward. More importantly, what China is also focused on is becoming ever more productive in their agricultural systems and ensuring that China has less arable land
and less farmers
and less farmers than you had 50 years ago. But what is happening also is that China's making that land more productive. And China's also looking to develop relationships with other countries where, when required, that you can also import. And that's why it's so important that China is working to assist other countries that have more arable land with their agricultural productivity, giving them the ability to increase the quantity and quantity of their yields and making more food available for export as well.
And here in China, there is a strong narrative that says China must maintain a minimum arable land size. That is, in China is 800 million more. That is roughly 53 million hectares of land. Do you think it is necessary because it's very controversial here in China? Many say we can import food from elsewhere. We don't want those lands still used as for agricultural use. We can develop it for industrial use. What is your take?
What China is doing is making their lands as productive as possible, as I stated, but also recognizing a balance between what they grow here and what they import. And every country today is looking to balance between imports and in domestically grown agriculture. And that's important. Most people aren't aware that we have edible plants on Earth. We consume about 60% of all the kilocalories consumed are from 3 plants, rice, wheat, and corn, which are the 3 most polluting plants, require the most water, require the most land space. As we diversify diets, which China is also successfully doing, we will use more of those plants that require less water, less arable land. And so there's a mixture of diversification of diet, diversification of agricultural crops, as well as at the micro level, and then that macro level economic work that must be performed that balances between what you import and what you grow.
And do we have the technology right now to meet the needs, as you said?
We very much have the technology, and what we don't have in use today, I had the benefit of meeting with some young college students who are working on developing the technology for the future that will continue to give us the tools that are necessary to evolve into the societies, not just here in China, but globally, to produce what is required. There is a projection from population scientists that we will have something between 9.5 billion and 10 billion people on Earth by 2050, requiring
that's another
us,
2 billion people on
that's
this planet.
another 2 billion people, requiring us to double agricultural productivity globally. And in order to do that, we will need to continue to evolve the techniques that we use, the seeds that we use, providing more access to drought-resilient seeds. As the climate affects what is possible for us to grow anywhere on Earth. So the answers that we have today are for today, but we must continue to invest in the science and the innovation that's necessary so that we can continue to evolve agricultural productivity to meet the needs of the global
And how
community.
important is international cooperation for this to happen?
We can't do it without international cooperation. The reality is that no one country alone can address the challenges that are going to affect global agricultural productivity alone. And so it requires that the kind of leadership that China is demonstrating in their hosting of the G20 agriculture ministers meeting this week, where they have placed food security and nutrition at the top of the agenda for the G20 agriculture ministers, making it part of the priority initiatives for the G20 leaders themselves, is the kind of global leadership and cooperation that is going to be required over the next 20 to 30 years to ensure that the entire global community is performing the work that's necessary.
All right, very good. We're talking about food security here on Dialogue with the Director General of World Food Program. Don't go away, you're watching Dialogue. We'll be right back. Well, Director Cousin, do you think people around the world understand the seriousness of food shortage, or should I say food security, enough as they should?
No, they don't. This is not a dialogue that is covered around kitchen tables or dining room tables in most households.
Most people take food for granted.
They do. They take food for granted until they no longer have access to it. And too often, our news media doesn't cover the challenges of those who are food insecure until it's a crisis. And so the work that is necessary on an ongoing basis is not considered by the average person. But we need to change that. And so I spend a lot of time, along with my colleagues, in conversations like this one, in hopes that we can raise a level of understanding amongst the global community about what is possible.
Let's talk about those factors that might pose dangers to food security. Some say climate change is a big challenge. It causes an estimated 400,000 deaths every year, and recent studies predict additional 600 million people's lives might be affected because of global warming. Water scarcity that could lead to problems in India and China, where almost 2 billion people live. So how big a problem of climate change for food security?
It's a significant problem for the poorest people in the world. 80% of the population that WFP supports today, we support about 80 million people. 80% of that population lives in climate marginal lands. And
Africa and Asia.
Africa and Asia. And as a result, that means that the kind of adaptation activities that the global community committed to last year at the Climate Summit, to investing in the result that's necessary to support populations, those poor populations in those areas, is not only necessary, but it will determine whether or not we can reduce the number of people who suffer from food insecurity, whether or not we can reduce the number of disasters as a result of climate change.
Because of the life of our future generations.
It is a life-death question. And when you live in a land that's desertified because of lack of access to water, or you live in areas that are prone to flooding because rains come and they come too much and there's no way of monitoring or mitigating the damage that occurs, then what is a flood becomes a crisis. What is a drought becomes a disaster and ultimately results in death or because of lack of access to food. That doesn't need to happen. The tools are available to build the kind of mitigation systems that would give us the ability to manage risk as opposed to managing disasters. But again, what it requires is the investment that's necessary from the entire global community to support those governments that are working to address the challenges of people who live in marginal places.
Another thing that you mentioned is disasters, natural disasters like earthquakes and floods and droughts in many parts of the world. They could lead to food shortage and even turmoil in that country. But I know that you've been advocating a different strategy from just aid to development. Tell me what exactly you mean by that.
Well, what I say is that the Philippines is a great example of this.
Haiyan.
The Typhoon Haiyan. In the days after Typhoon Haiyan, we quickly reverted and converted from supporting with direct food assistance those people to providing the kind of access to the seeds and tools with other partners that help people rebuild their agricultural land, to supporting access to a productive social safety net program that the government initiated, that we helped them implement, that rebuilt markets.
Have you seen any progress by adapting this kind of change of strategy?
Well, we saw progress, as I said, in Haiyan. And what we saw recently was in the conversation at the World Humanitarian Summit, where global leaders came together to again talk about what is necessary for us to address the evolving food security and other challenges in the world, was a commitment from the global community to supporting that agility for humanitarian and development actors to work together to provide the assistance that's necessary.
But sometimes this kind of problems can develop into crises, economic crises, humanitarian crises, and even political crises. How do you look at the dangers of a food problem, food scarcity problem, being developed into a larger problem?
Well, often, and we saw this in the late 90s, when you had urban food riots across different countries, or in 25 different cities around the world, where the lack of access to affordable food resulted in people rioting in the streets. Some would argue, in fact, that the Arab Spring was a direct result of lack of access
and also some
to
say
food.
the conflict in Syria has a lot to do with climate change and drought and food problem.
We often forget or fail to realize that for 2 years prior to the start of the Syrian conflict, there had been a drought in Syria, forcing farmers into the cities to make demands upon their government. And so people are not going to stay and wallow when they can't feed their children, when they don't have access to the tools that are necessary to perform productive agriculture. There's opportunity someplace else. And so you'll see more migration of population. You'll see populations making more demands. You cannot have peace where there is not food security. But we also will not have food security where there is no peace.
There is another problem. We've been talking a lot about production of food and also about distribution of food. Do you think we have an ideal, efficient system of distributing food? Because the reason I ask this, there are a lot of food are wasted
Yes.
In this process.
Yes. We don't have the ideal system. In Africa,
What is missing?
In sub-Saharan Africa alone, we know that almost $6 billion is lost in post-harvest agricultural losses occur every year because of lack of infrastructure, lack of storage, lack of access to the tools that are necessary for a proper post-harvest handling of commodities, and food is rotted and lost. And we know that if we could save all of the food that is lost in sub-Saharan Africa through these poor post-harvest handling practices because of lack of transportation, lack of roads, lack of infrastructure, including storage. That totals more than all the aid that is given to Africa on an annual basis.
So this is incredible. But that has a lot to do with nation building in a particular country, isn't it?
It is about development in those countries, yes. Very much so. It is very much about the development, which is, again, why it's so important that humanitarian and development actors come together to bring all of the tools that are necessary to support populations. And we can begin to address many of the challenges of post-harvest losses with low-tech, low-cost solutions. It doesn't require billions of dollars of infrastructure development. Let me give you an example. In Uganda, WFP works with about 20,000 farmers where we assisted them with training and a new post-harvest storage facility that we could manufacture in Uganda using materials that are available in Uganda. And we reduced losses working with these farmers by 97%. We had MIT come in and evaluate to prove that this system works. Now the World Bank is working with us and the Uganda government to increase that to 250,000. Imagine if we could increase those kinds of low-tech systems that would help 2 million farmers. Those are the kinds of activities that we must invest in to ensure that we can make the progress. Because if we simply say it requires billions of dollars of infrastructure development, governments will throw up their hands and we won't see the progress that's necessary. It's about taking one step at a time and making the investments that are necessary to make the most difference in the lives of those that we serve.
I also want to talk about the question between surplus and shortage, because according to UN figures, nearly 800 million people remain malnutrition and undernourished, and 2 billion suffer from deficiencies of all kinds. But on the other hand, 6 million people are obese because they're overfed. It seems ironic to have, on one hand, people are overfed, and on the other hand, people are dying because of hunger. How can we solve this contradiction?
We are beginning to see in many developing countries a double burden of undernutrition, malnourishment, and overnutrition, obesity, as you've just discussed. And what we see many times is there's a direct link between children who are undernourished and they become obese adults. And it has a great deal to do with eating habits. And when your body does not receive appropriate micronutrients as a child, people tend to overeat as adults. And we also know that in many countries, it's a sign of prosperity to move from eating traditional foods to consuming sugar, salt,
But actually it is not.
And actually it is not. And increasing the kilocalorie intake for populations as they grow economically. And what it requires is that we start with that first 1,000 days of a child and ensuring that they're receiving adequate micronutrients so that they're not malnourished, and then teaching people about what are the right foods to consume throughout their lives. And if we balance between ensuring that people have access to the right foods and information about what are the right foods to consume, we can address both ends of the malnourishment spectrum, both the undernourishment and the obesity
So
issue.
relief and also training and resources provision and education, all these are your missions. And thank you very much today for joining us and sharing your thoughts and experiences.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Director Cousin, thank you. And you've been back here on CCTV News. I hope you've enjoyed our program, and thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.